podcast number 26. Hi, I'm Edward Funk, and this is podcast number 26. The last podcast, um, I met Loretta Young's three sisters, and in this podcast, I'm going to meet her two sons. Now, she had a daughter, Judy, who she was estranged from. Uh, so we'll deal with that in future podcasts. But for now, let's just talk about the boys. Chris and Peter were 11 months apart, and my birthday just happened to be right in the middle of the two of them. So all three of us were basically age 45. Now, Chris and his wife Linda, they lived 100 miles east of Los Angeles in Palm Springs, and Peter's wife Corinne and their two pretty small children lived in Solvang, California, about 100 miles north. Now, in time, I would sense that the difference geographically was symbolic of their overall relationship. The circumstances of Loretta's second marriage to Tom Lewis, he was the father of the boys, and I think it might explain, at least from my perspective, the familial relationships between all of them. Loretta had six kind of tumultuous years in her 20s with men such as Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable, and she was looking for stability. And here's Tom Lewis, 11 years older, a Catholic but never married, and a career of his own. He was a account guy for an important advertising agency. And back in those days, the agencies produced the radio shows. Tom was a producer for the Kate Smith show. And so put this in perspective. The radio was what TV would be in another 10 years. So he was in an important position. Loretta liked the idea that he wasn't in the movie business, but that close enough he could understand it. Now, it was a marriage built on deception from the beginning. This is, of course, my own take, but Loretta married Tom with the appearance of the idea that here was a big, strong man that was going to take care of her and make the decisions affecting them. But in reality, she knew that Tom liked to live extravagantly, didn't have the income to do that. They'd have to count on her being the breadwinner, which meant that she was really holding the reins. And Tom's deception was, he was hoping he could leapfrog from being a radio producer to a movie producer through all of Loretta's connections. Well, it really didn't happen. The one movie he did produce was about 12 years after they were married. It was called Cause for Alarm. Really not a bad movie, but it starred, guess who? Loretta Young and Dory Sherry, who ran MGM. The only reason he let Tom do that movie was as a favor to Loretta. Okay, where am I? So, with his career kind of petering out, but what happened right after I missed an important part. During World War II, Tom was the head of Armed Forces Radio. He was Colonel Tom Lewis. And by all accounts, he did a good job with that. But also, he probably wouldn't have gotten that job if he didn't have all the connections he had made through Loretta. So when the war was over, he came back to that ad agency and blew a lot of money redecorating his office. And the head of the agency said, "What the hell are you thinking?" And Tom's feelings were hurt. And he said, "Well, I quit." So then his focus was he was going to be Loretta's financial manager. Well, as his son Chris told me, Tom wasn't a businessman. So eventually his focus was more on the two boys. Um, but it was an easy alliance because uh, Tom had such overt favoritism towards Chris. Um, Tom came up with this idea of the PCT Club, Peter, Chris, and Tom. Uh, but again, Chris was everything in his father's eyes, and uh, Peter referred to the PCT Club as the fucking PCT Club. Um, Now, both Peter and Chris pursued careers in the entertainment business. Um, Now, Chris and Linda operated their own production company. Mainly, they did documentaries, but they also did some entertainment films that went directly to video. But I should add that these were direct-to-video films that actually made money, so they were successful. Now, Peter was a founding member of the Moby Grape, an acid rock 60s San Francisco band. Now, my first meeting with Chris, Chris and Linda, was on an evening when we'd been invited by a friend of Loretta's to go to dinner. And then a few days later in that same week, I drove to Palm Springs and to interview Chris. It was cool because I could see Chris sitting there by the pool wearing a jacket. His answers were very thoughtful. The one question I do remember was, did he ever think that his dad was happy? And his reply was, being happy was never important to his dad. What was important was that people saw him as important. So I think that said a lot. I also drove to Solvang to interview Peter. I mean, he was a friendly guy. I mean, less restrained than his brother. And he was frank about the hangups of being the son of a famous mother. There was a poster-sized picture hanging on his living room wall. It was of Loretta and Tyrone Power. It was the pictures to promote the movie Second Honeymoon. It was photographed by George Hurrell, who arguably was the most famous, maybe unarguably, was the most famous photographer of that golden era of all the big stars. So now here's the little detour. I actually met George Hurrell about the second week I was working with Loretta. She had decided she wanted to change the fan picture she'd been sending out and had posed for a new picture a couple weeks earlier. So the three of us were sitting at the dining room table, and I could tell that Hurrell had taken the picture to completion for his satisfaction, but that also he was very ready for whatever his client was going to tell him. And in this case, Loretta wanted all the wrinkles removed. And so after he left, I said, Loretta, why don't you leave some of those small wrinkles in? People know that you're not 35. I think they'd be amazed with how great you really do look. So anyway, she was patient with my comment, but the next time I saw that pictures, all wrinkles were out. Now, one more George Hurrell thing. I don't know how quickly this happened, but I came across a book of his portraits on a shelf in Loretta's living room. And that same picture that was of Loretta and Tyrone Power that had been on the wall in Peter's home was on the cover of this book. Uh, hmm. Inside there was an inscription. It said, Loretta, I chose you for the cover because you're the most beautiful of them all. Now, I thought how diplomatic he was because he said, you are the most beautiful of them all, not you were the most beautiful of them all. Now, back to Peter. His main focus continued to be his music. And a few weeks after I visited him in Solvang, he came down to Los Angeles and invited me to join him. Um, well, he came down because he was going to make an appearance with the Moby Grape at a Sunset Strip club. And he invited me to join him. We'd meet first at his mom's house in Beverly Hills. So we did, and Laura fried some hamburgers for us. And then when she stepped out of the room, Peter said to me, "Man, you don't know what a big deal this is. I've waited my whole life for my mom to fry me a hamburger." And incidentally, the stools that Peter and I were sitting on that evening are now in my kitchen. I joined him at the club, and I'm not much of a rock fan, but I could still appreciate how much this meant to Peter and to the rest of the guys in the Moby Grape, and also to all the other people there. I mean, they just kind of stood there and nodded their head and totally got lost in being back into the 60s. Now, my immersion into Loretta's life um, was really kind of heady. For the first 6 weeks, I think I became lightheaded every time I walked into her door. Uh, and although much of the world had forgotten about Loretta Young, she delivered to me the Hollywood uh, of my youthful dreams. I started sliding into Loretta's life more and more. And when she wasn't going out, and it was surprising how often she did, she'd also invite me to dinner. Um, she had this young friend, I think I might have mentioned her earlier, um, who prepared some meals, and then all Loretta had to do is pop it in the oven. But when she didn't have all those meals that were prepared by Darlene, um, she would open a can of red pepper soup and fry a hamburger. And she'd also make a salad. And whatever she did elegantly. For instance, the salad with the tomatoes, they were skinned and de-seeded. And I'd never had tomatoes in a salad like that. One evening we were doing dishes. She was washing, I was drying. She handed me a plate that didn't meet my inspection, and I handed it back. She looked at me askance and with raised eyebrows said, "Really?" But then she smiled. I don't think figuratively many people had ever handed her back a dish to do over again. I knew at that moment that we were becoming better friends. Now, the first evening I went out with her, uh, I accompanied her and her friend Dan Donahue. Now, he was a rich Catholic, rich enough that the Vatican knighted him as Sir Daniel Donovan because of his generous contributions. What I remember most about that evening, we were riding in his Jaguar. He and Loretta were in the front seat, I was in the back. They were lamenting um, about the state of the world, that people had become so money hungry uh, that they took their focus off the more important things. Now, we had started that evening out at Daniel's house, and so I knew that besides his Jaguar, he had a Rolls Royce. And I already knew that Loretta had a Rolls Royce. Uh, so as I listened to them uh, lament about the money hungry people in the world, I thought to myself, they each have Rolls Royces at home in their garages. So now, that same evening, I remember talking about me, still they're in the front seat, I'm in the back seat, as if I wasn't even there. And uh, she said, I'm not sure how this book will turn out, but this young man is such a good listener. He's so very, very sensitive. Um, and I was very, very sensitive at that time, but what she didn't know is that it flowed from a nervous breakdown I'd had less than a year before. And um, after we started working together, I was grateful that there had been a bit of time before I was able to meet her agent, and then even more time before I got to meet Loretta. Because when I'd come home from those days working, I was really exhausted, um, and I just felt that um, I was being allowed to recover at a pace that was providential. Now by spring, I was comfortable in Loretta's home. I had my own key to the kitchen door. I also knew the how to disable the alarm so you could go up to the second floor. Uh, and there were more and more evenings where we just hung out at her home. Um, Now, some of these times we were watching her old movies, but I have to say, she really didn't like watching her old movies. But she did have maybe 70 of her 98 movies on video, and I wanted to see them all. So sometimes she agreed to. Sometimes I could take them home and watch them, and sometimes she agreed to sit there and watch them with me. Um, and most of these videos that she had of her own collection were a gift from Sammy Davis Jr. Um, Loretta had the most interesting um, birth of friends. I mean, all kinds of people, and she really um, knew how to enjoy all of them. Now, in the next podcast, I'll relate some of secrets Loretta shared with me when making the most of her character. Some secrets that she told me never to tell anybody. And also, we'll meet Josie Wayne, John Wayne's first wife. Josie was one of two of Loretta's best friends all the way back from childhood. So I look forward to seeing you then. Ciao, ciao.